Hi friends, welcome to Learn in Minute series. This is Varun here. I'm going to contrast the monolith architecture and the microservices architecture. These two diagrams clearly explain what the monolith architecture is and what the microservices architecture is. When looking into the monolith architecture, are those which have huge systems. That is the major concern which comes to our mind. The monolith architecture, it's just one machine which is running the entire system. When coming to this microservice architecture, it is not that. It is tiny and tiny, where just one function running on one machine, and they have tiny databases which even with each of them connected internally. This is what this microservices architecture is. All the clients are connected to different microservices, while in case of monolith, it has all of these clients connected to the single machine. In case of microservice, it is a single business unit where all the data or all the functions which are relevant to the service are put into one service. If you can separate it with a lot of concerns being separated out, then you probably want to separate a single service into pieces. It's not a tiny machine which interact with each other all the time. The microservice, it's just the service. It's not a tiny machine. It's a service which interact with each other all the time. Let us look into the advantage and disadvantage of these two architecture categories. Starting with the advantages of a monolith, the scale up is the first advantage. When you put under a lot of load, the monolith architecture, it scales out so that you have multiple server, so it easily scales out and it can adapt all those huge load on it. Second is less complex. That is, you don't need to wonder how to break the different functions that need to be performed in the system, or even after breaking, how to merge those things. All these things you need not think of. Just you can go with the functions or the operations that need to be performed by the system. The third advantage is less duplication. So that need not duplicate, or there is no need for any duplication of the code or the services in the monolith. It's all the same. It's all in one service in case of this monolith architecture. Last advantage is it's faster. You have no call to wait for a network because all the things are kept in a same box. So it's actually in the same box. So yeah, there is no need for waiting for a networks to get connected. So it's going to run faster compared to the microservice architecture. When coming to the disadvantages part of the monolith architecture, first is when you when there is a need for adding a new member into your team, or it may be a developer. When you go into add a new developer into your team, they need to have a lot of context on what they are developing, because they need to understand the entire process of the ERP, because it's together or it's in the same box. When discussing about this deployment, so the deployments are complicated in the monolith architecture, because any change in the code in any part of the system, it requires a new deployment. So obviously this deployment is complicated in the monolith architecture. And another disadvantage of using this monolith is there is too much responsibility on each server. If any of the server crashes, the entire system, the whole system get collapsed. So there is too much of responsibility over the server. This is another one major disadvantage of going with this monolith architecture. Now let's get into the positives of microservices. The major advantage of going for this microservices is it's easier to scale. So all the entire functions that need to be performed by the system has been done in separates, so that if you want to scale up or if you want to add a particular function to the system, you could easily add it separately. Similarly, if there is a new member getting into this microservices architecture, when you go with this microservice architecture, if you want to add a new member to your team, it is easy for them to just go with the particular task or the particular function assigned to them. So they are going to look into the particular task corresponding to the particular service alone. So it is easier for the new member to adapt to this system. And the third advantage of using this microservices is the parallel development is easier, because there is less dependency between the developers of different services. All the services has been developed separately, so you do not worry about developing those services parallelly. So these are the major advantages of the microservices architecture. Now the funny part of the disadvantages of microservices architecture, it's not easy to design. So you need to design the entire part, you need to assign to the various team who are working for the particular function. You need to separate the entire process into number of subparts, how we are going to separate it, then after developing how we are going to merge it. All these are tough things to design. Second is very tough to maintain. So as we have already seen, number of services, a number of teams working on the services, then merging it, it's very tough to maintain the microservices architecture. And the last disadvantage of the microservice architecture is need a smart architects, because there are different services working on different operations of a system. The architect need to design how which service going to have, or which team is going to do the particular service, how we are going to merge the service. All these should be designed, so there need to be a smart architect to do with this. You have got some idea about what is this monolith architecture, what is this microservice architecture, how it differs from each other. Because without knowing how this differs, there are lots of controversies in understanding the monolith and microservices. Without knowing the difference, it is very tough for us to decide which service we need to take for the enterprise which we are going to develop. Thank you. See you in another Learn in Minute series.